Many pillars of the Christian faith had iconic demonstrations early in their careers that would point to future acclaim, as can be seen in such instances as Christ's Sermon on the Mount or Peter's impromptu Pentecost sermon. Yet what is to be made of the Apostle Paul's freshman entry into the world of evangelism? How could Paul's early work as a novice inspire us today? We will examine these questions on today's edition of Truth Unveiled. One of the most significant authors in the New Testament is the Apostle Paul. Paul, meaning small, is the name he was given after his conversion. Ironically, he was also one of the staunchest adversaries to the early church movement. It was clear that Paul had a zeal in opposing what he initially saw as an adulteration to Judaism. Yet who could have foreseen the impact that Paul's aptitude would have in propagating the Christian faith? Today, we could see how the early onset of talents can lead to a realization of more impactful achievements in the future. All we need do is simply to look at the emergence of gifts and abilities fostered in children. Who would think that those piano lessons would one day produce a world-famous pianist? Or that those singing lessons after school might just give way to a renowned opera singer? The skills that many accomplished people presently display in their respective endeavors first appeared unrefined sometime in their past, and grew into the recognition that they would enjoy presently. In 1915, a 14-year-old with an interest in drawing named Walter entered the Kansas City Art Institute for weekend art classes. Who could have foreseen from the skill level that Walter displayed at the time that 13 years later he would go on to create one of the most iconic characters in American culture? Known professionally as Walt Disney, he would go on to be a pioneer in the world of animation, whose legacy would create the conglomerate that bears his name today. The Apostle Paul also evolved from a similar trajectory. Paul was an ardent follower of Judaism and received training as a young man from prestigious instructors. He later would go on to serve as a great disruption to the community of believers, as Paul was appointed to lead operations that would hunt followers of Christ. During one of his enforcement campaigns, Paul experienced a vision where he was confronted by the risen Christ. The sudden encounter left Paul stunned and temporarily blind. Following a period of orientation with a local emissary sent from God, Paul's sight was restored. He immediately began his preaching ministry by preaching among the very people he was pursuing. And so we came to see how Paul exhibited certain talents and abilities and skills that would later go on to have a great impact on the Christian world. In fact, it was those very same abilities that contributed to the formation of that Christian world, that very Christian world that we know today. And we could see how this began in Acts chapter 9, in verse 20. And immediately he began preaching about Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is indeed the Son of God." All who heard him were amazed. Isn't this the same man who caused such devastation among Jesus' followers in Jerusalem? And didn't he come here to arrest them and take them in chains to the leading priest? And please remember, Paul's name was originally Saul, and it was changed after his conversion. And continuing on in verse 22, Saul's preaching became more and more powerful, and the Jews in Damascus couldn't refute his proofs that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. And so we see glimpses of the accomplishments that Paul would later come to bring about. From the skill set that he had at this time that he is exhibiting, who would have thought that he would have been such a major contributor to Christianity? And we see that Paul came to write nearly half of the books that are held and contained in the New Testament. He relayed a lot of the theology that Christianity contains. He came to integrate the Gentiles into this religion, this following of Christ. And understand, originally there really wasn't that much separation or difference between early Christianity and Judaism. Yet Gentiles were kind of on the outskirts of Judaism. And so Paul came and he really made Gentiles a part of this movement. And they came to become strong followers of Christ and keepers of the same rules and regulations and followings that God had extended to the Jews, or to the nation of Israel and the 12 tribes. And we come to see the Gentiles, they took this to heart, and they became strong followers of God themselves. And Paul was a big contributor to that happening. He was a big part of that being made possible. And Paul's work at the time, throughout Asia Minor, he was establishing congregations and bringing the gospel and the news of what Christ had done and accomplished through his life, death, and resurrection, all throughout the region. Paul was a major force in what Christianity was becoming and what it eventually became on throughout the future, because his writings have been the impetus for many people coming to learn about God, coming to understand the intricacies of how to use God's Spirit and the steps that are taken in spiritual development, all because of what Paul was able to do and what he contributed at the time and what he continues to contribute posthumously. And it isn't just what Paul was able to do from small beginnings as a novice and a preacher concerning the kingdom of God. It isn't just what Paul was able to do as a novice and a believer of Christ, as a novice in truly being worked with by God the Father. It isn't just what he was able to do from such small beginnings, but what he was going to become and what he was able to do for those that would hear him. True, he did come from small beginnings in terms of his commitment to the faith. He was not a part of it. Initially, he was an antagonist to that faith. But who would have been able to foresee that the display of skills on his first day on the job and preaching about what Christ had attained and who Christ truly was, who would have been able to foresee what that initial first day on the job was going to turn into in terms of his contribution to Christianity? Likewise, who would be able to foresee what those that would hear his words would become, and how they'd be able to take that understanding and begin to form a relationship with God, and the track that they then would embark upon in developing the character of God within themselves and being able to look forward to the things that God would make of them in this life and in the future when Christ returns to establish his kingdom, in the future when God is going to transform individuals that underwent this process of development into spirit beings and be able to be and see Christ as he is. Who would have been able to foresee such a thing? And so Paul, knowing this and being familiar with this, as he continued in his ministry years on, would teach that the focus is on what one is able to do in relying on God, what one is able to do and looking to God for that power. As his followers, as his listeners, would likewise have equally small beginnings, equally small displays of what they would go on to truly achieve when God was finished with them in the future. And we can see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1. And Paul says, "And you should imitate me just as I imitate Christ," directing listeners to the power of Christ, directing listeners to the reliance of Christ, directing listeners to rely on being fueled by God's Spirit and what His Spirit will do in transforming one's mind and one's behavior and inner thoughts. And so these followers too would have flashes and glimpses of what they would soon come to be in the future. Paul continues in his further contact with the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and in verse 18 he says, "So all of us who have had that veil removed, that understanding that is now imparted to us, that was once clouded, that veil has been removed, and now these individuals can see and reflect the glory of the Lord. Begin to have these attributes and skill sets and abilities imparted to them and displayed in them now. Although in small doses, although being seen in a narrow fashion, but one day when the work that is being done is finished and every individual and every follower of Christ and is brought to fruition in the future, it will show that point from point A to the final ultimate arrival of point B of what God was doing. And just as a child takes on musical studies and grows into a more proficient musician, just as Paul started and displayed with a small display of his abilities and what those abilities would eventually accomplish as he became more and more proficient in his career, so too the followers of God begin small with the abilities and talents that God has imparted to them and will ultimately become something far more greater, far more visible and apparent when God has finished his work in the followers of Christ and those believers that pledge themselves to God. And that is what this glory is that's being reflected, that Paul is speaking of. So once that veil is removed, and now these individuals can see and reflect the glory of the Lord, and the Lord, who is the Spirit, that power that drives these abilities to take on those changes and mold these individuals into the character of God. Once that Spirit is now imparted to these individuals and put to use, it makes us more and more like Him as we are changed into His glorious image. This is that trek, that journey from small and hidden and kind of obscure into full-blown apparent greatness that God is bringing about. Paul, having had a long career showing commitment to God and bringing this word and this knowledge of the kingdom of Christ to his region, to his area, and establishing a great Christian community, among Jews and Gentile, and even after his death, continuing to do such. He, prior to his last days, came to reflect on all that he had achieved after having put in all of this work. And he writes a letter to one of his proteges, Timothy, in 2 Timothy chapter 4. And he shares, "As for me, my life has already been poured out as an offering to God. The time of my death is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I have remained faithful. And now the prize awaits me, the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on the day of his return." And Paul finishes by saying, "And the prize is not just for me, but for all who eagerly look forward to his appearing." Paul acknowledges all those individuals that he would have touched through his work in his day and in the future, and recognizes that this development, this journey of starting out small, of having small talents that would grow, having abilities that would not be as easily recognized, and translating individuals into the achievements and final sculptures that God is making. He recognizes that ultimately all these individuals that started off as a novice, as he did, will one day be born into the family of God, fully developed and mature. We too must recognize that same journey that Paul went on. And as the young musician grows and develops in their skill level, as many individuals that have achieved a lot of recognition in their fields have grown and developed in their area and arena of contribution, we too must recognize as followers of God that the abilities and talents that God has given us now, we are to use to become what he is making. We are to use his spirit in maintaining a relationship with God. And just as Paul started off small and no one would have been able to foresee what he became, we too are following in those same footsteps and becoming more and more like God.
Hi, we would like to offer some free study materials that will help you examine the question we addressed today. We would like you to listen to the sermon, The Evolution of Paul, by Robert Gov. Jr. Also, we would like you to listen to the sermon, Thank God for Paul, by Wayne Hendricks. You can find both of these sermons by visiting cgi.org and visiting the sermon section of the website and searching for the title of the message. If you live in New York City, New York, and would like to attend church with today's presenter, George Roper, visit cginewyork.org for more information. Thanks again for watching Truth Unveiled.